I'm here today with a mom who's going to remain anonymous. She has small kids, but she does want to share her story because, again, it's another instance of a mom being concerned about what's happening, wanting to share her story to let people know what's going on. So why don't you just go ahead and get started and tell us what's happening in your life?
Okay, thanks so much for the opportunity to be with you. Last year, after over 19 years of marriage, my ex-husband and I divorced. Our son, who struggles with his sexuality, currently calling himself transgender.
So
Um,
how old was your son when he started identifying as transgender?
I'm trying to look back on that to see what signs there may have been. Our boys were very close in age, and so they were almost like twins. And if I had to say that one of them was more feminine than another or more sensitive than another, it would actually be my oldest. I mean, the boys were always very boyish. I mean, they were all about dirt. They were all about dinosaurs. They were all about cars. In fact, our son who struggles um, was probably the dirtiest. I remember one of my favorite T-shirts of his was a white T-shirt that said, "My favorite color is dirt."
I think what you're describing is really typical of a lot of kids these days that are coming out as transgender, that they don't have that childhood history of gender dysphoria that used
No,
to be sort of identifiable. So,
right, and I think that parents, and I try to tell parents this even now. And there was an issue initially in court with the medical records. My ex-husband wanted to keep his particular medical records from me, and now I'm finding out that the therapist who had been seeing him was applying all of the principles of the therapist that you are starting to expose, all of those, and the exact narrative that came out in court about the emotional abuse and the verbal abuse, that sort of thing, that mom, is subject to if he's with her, and she should not be with him unless he wants it, is exactly what we were hearing in court. And the judge, thank God, was a very pro-family, very equal judge. I had that going for me. She was very livid when my ex-husband and his attorney wanted to keep the records from me. She said, "There is no one in my court who will come in here and say that one parent does not have the same access as the other to their medical records, or one parent does not have access to the appointments, that sort of thing."
and I just wanted to clarify for people who are watching who aren't familiar with some of the tactics that are being used, because you mentioned being accused of verbal abuse or emotional abuse. And for those who don't know what's going on, therapists are redefining these terms. And so basically, what they're saying is if a parent doesn't affirm and accept a child 100%, that's now considered abuse. So, as a mother, if you don't agree that your son is actually a girl and approve of his preferred pronouns and name and even medical treatments, then you are now guilty of abuse according to this new model of therapy. And I just
Exactly.
wanted to clarify that because typically in the past, when you'd hear something like emotional or verbal abuse, there was something very clear. People understood sort of what that meant. But now the terms are being redefined in a way that is incredibly dangerous because part of a parent's job is actually to help guide a child. And in this model of therapy, if you don't completely agree with your child, you're guilty of abuse. So it basically undermines parents.
Exactly. He's alienated them.
And when did he start seeing this therapist?
He has seen her for a total of about 2.5 years. The therapist at that point had been coming in, doing some things in our home with her. She was an in-home therapist. And the link that I sent you to the therapist's current profile at the place she's working now, you'll see that most of her history is with younger children, and she doesn't even claim to have a specialty in gender dysphoria, gender identity, anything like that. But what we were seeing is that she was coming into our home, um, pulling individual family members aside, taking walks with them, and we just trusted her that this is part of the process. And she would sit down in the living room sometimes and give her values of how we should just and when she would share things like this, like her values, her belief system, her it's basically a worldview with our family. I would see my son who struggles start to defend her, and I would see that connection between the two of them. And then I would see my ex-husband not really stand up, and he had a lot of trouble with standing up to my son. So I had filed a grievance at the center she was working at against her unethical behavior, and that investigation lasted for several months. I believe that my ex-husband was even asked to come in for a psychiatric evaluation. She had to go for an evaluation. Whatever she was counseling him with was her own belief system, her own research, her own values.
And one of the models of that is being used now is the idea that the therapist should assume the role of a parent. And so I'm sure that she saw you as an inadequate parent, and so she was actually adopting the role of parent, and your ex-husband was enabling that to happen.
And I remember a couple of telephone conversations that I had with her saying, I'm concerned about his depression. I'm concerned because he's always in his room. He's cursing me. He's waiting until his dad goes to work at night, and he's lashing out. I think he's struggling with his identity, and I want you to know that we don't embrace that. We're asking you to figure out what's going on with him, what's making him angry, helping him identify this whatever struggle he's dealing with. If someone's bullying him, or if there's anxiety about other issues, but we're asking you not to embrace that. And I remember she would often turn it around on me, and so then I kind of stopped talking to her on the phone, and I went to my ex-husband and I said, he needs to be away from her. She's approaching this from a worldview. Better to get him away from her before he really bonds and connects with her anymore, and we get him in a place where he can get the best therapy. He said, well, I just can't pull him away from her right now.
It's almost like the one parent who is affirming wants to stay friends with the child, doesn't want to, they want to be their buddy. They don't want to be the parent. And I think this is a really difficult dynamic because kids need parents. And if they know that they have a parent who they can push around basically and is going to let them get away with stuff, then they're just going to keep pushing and see where those boundaries are. And that's something that I'm seeing a lot in this dynamic, is that there's a parent who just just affirms and won't stand up to the child. So what is the situation now with your son? How has he started a transition? Has he
he wants to be called Sophia. That is his chosen name.
And did he have a female identity?
Yes. It was shocking at first, but it was almost a relief for me too, because having been trolled and having been attacked online and having had those volatile conversations early on with that therapist that we've been speaking of, and actually one time I did go to an actual session. I didn't get to mention that, and she actually stood up in her office and screamed at me and said that kids do know as early as 13 or 14 what sex they want to be, what gender they want to be. So finding his profile on Snapchat, I think that was about 6 months ago, really solidified that for me. But then just about 2 months ago, I was shopping with our youngest daughter, and she said, Mommy, our son, she said his name, wants to be called Sophia. And I said, oh, well, his name's not Sophia. And it just kind of brushed it off because I'm not sure how to talk to her about this yet. And I said, his name's not Sophia. And she just goes on about her day. But then she becomes increasingly more anxious over the next couple of months. But I said, that he's a boy. And I said, I just want to let you know that you don't have to feel like you have to call him Sophia. There are other ways to support him without calling him Sophia and encouraging him to be a boy. I just want you to know that.
And actually, as you're talking about this, it occurs to me that one thing that I hadn't really thought about was the impact of a child assuming a transgender identity and how that affects especially younger siblings, especially if they're young enough to really still be grappling with, some of these ideas that are complicated, that if they're being told by an older sibling that they're born in the wrong body and that's possible, and then they have parents who don't affirm that. I mean, it can be very confusing for a child to have to navigate these really complicated family dynamics, and to have part of the transgender narrative seems to be that insistence that everybody affirm them and call them by the appropriate pronouns and names, which I would think would be really hard for a child who'd grown up with her brother, calling her brother by a certain name, knowing her brother was a boy, and then having her brother essentially bully her into accepting the new identity and the all that comes with that new identity. I would think that would be really confusing.
Definitely bullying going on, and a lot of bullying takes place. And I just left it there. I mean, we didn't go into a long conversation about transgenderism, or because she says he won't let me in this room, or he won't let me in that room. He won't give me this if I don't call him Sophia. That they can love him and interact with him, and if he bullies them and says, you need to call me Sophia or I'm going to commit suicide, that they can respond to him. They know how to respond to him, and they can walk away from that interaction feeling confident and not owning any of that guilt, not owning any of that. There's something going on in him that he needs to deal with, and that they don't ever need to feel guilty or own any of his stuff.
You have custody, it's supposed to be split. You're supposed to have decisions about what therapists they see and other important life decisions, but you've been pretty much cut out of the picture, it sounds like.
But when it came down to the actual divorce, my ex-husband would not agree to divorce me unless I rendered him custody of the kids as the primary parent of residence. So he is the primary parent of residence, but we both have 50-50 custody, 50-50 decision making and medical, that type of thing.
A parent's right to see their children and have those decisions is not based on the primary residence. And that's something that I see happening a lot, is that the parent who has primary residence seems to sometimes, first of all, create that division between the kids, but then to start making all those decisions. And it sounds like that's what's happened with you.
Yeah, he wanted the house. He was afraid that I was going to go for the house, which I didn't want to uproot the kids from the house. I mean, that's what they've always known. And additionally, it's right next to his family, and I want to be there. So I didn't wish to do that. I'm not a vindictive person at all. So we were able to work something out where he'll refinance the house and I'll get happy equity, that sort of thing. You can edit that if you want, but there were other things, like I wouldn't get child support. He wouldn't ask for child support from me. I wouldn't ask for child support from him, and that's for the rest of our lifetime. there were some things in there that I had to agree to, or he wouldn't divorce me.
One of the things that I'm also seeing is that parents, the family court system is so expensive. Trying to fight these issues is so expensive. It takes a lot of financial resources as well as emotional resources.
And it takes so long to get
And I'm
anything.
finding that people in your situation are just, they're so overwhelmed, and they don't have the funds to fight this. And so it's almost like you lose your parental rights simply because you don't have enough money to fight for them.
And we lose parental rights because by the time something happens in court, if there is another parent who is brainwashing the other child, and if you want to call that a different term or whatever, or if you have another family, like the family members that are instilling their values, if you want to say it more nicely, that sort of thing. By the time you get to court, you might have lost another 9 months or 10 months or a year.
I wondered if you could kind of summarize where things are with your son right now.
One time he came very close to me, and my ex-husband did come between he and I. He asked me, he said, we are trying to get the girls to call me Sophia, and we would appreciate it if you would comply. If I spiral into a spiraling downward abyss of suicide, it's going to be your fault. You people are the reason why trans commit suicide.
What you're describing is so typical, that it's almost like verbatim what the kids are kind of telling each other and being taught to say, is that, if I kill myself, it's your fault for not affirming me.
And I want to see my son transformed before he spirals into a full-blown lifestyle that is going to just devastate him, and he could even die from that.
And I know it's really hard to talk about these things, so I just want to thank you for sharing your experience.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity.